What's up, YouTube, and welcome back to another Director's Top 10. Now, for this director that we're doing, we're hitting one of the icons, and it's a damn shame because this is one of the guys that really should be up there every time we talk about, say, like a Spielberg or a Scorsese or any other one of the film brat generations. But because he didn't gain prominence until the end of the 70s, he will forever be the forgotten one, at least in terms of that sense, and that's Ridley Scott. His films have gone down in history for having some of the most grandiose, big feeling natures to them. He's one of the last filmmakers that can make a truly sprawling sword and sandals epic, while also revolutionizing the sci-fi genre. He's also one of the most efficient working directors today, putting out 2 movies across 2 separate years well into his 80s. And so today, in honor of both of his movies released in 2021, The Last Duel and House of Gucci, here are my top 10 favorite Ridley Scott movies. Prometheus. Now, this is an interesting one because it's one that previously myself and a lot of other people considered to be a bad movie. In fact, there are still a lot of bad movie cliches to be found here that I hate, but I've come to realize that this is truly the last time that Scott could have been as ambitious as a filmmaker with a big budget as he was, and actually work with people who could make that dream a reality, because it feels like every single movie that he's done since has attempted that but failed in some instance. After 33 years, Scott decided to return to the Alienverse, this time with a whole new aim than the one originally started by H.R. Giger, to introduce a sense of mythology and creationism involving one of the first major looks into android personification. After years in development hell, with Scott and James Cameron both attempting to come up with ideas for an Alien prequel, during which time the studio decided to place more emphasis on Alien vs. Predator, that should tell you all you need to know, a script was finally written by John Spates in 2009. After a rewrite from Damon Lindelof, of all people, Scott and Lindelof finally began developing a movie that, while taking place prior to the Alien films, would only contain seeds of the alien's DNA, without directly tying to it. A very interesting choice of words considering the film's subject matter. Taking place in the year 2089, the film follows the crew of the ship Prometheus, which lands on the barren moon of LV-223 in an expedition to find humanity's creators. The film was heavily criticized when it was released for too much of a sense of self-importance, but it's gained a little bit of a second life since, and it's one I'm definitely glad I gave a rewatch, because as someone who was completely unaware of what the Alien franchise even was when this film came out, it was super effective as a sci-fi horror with just a completely different tone than most that came before it. The film's themes of what happens when humanity attempts to play God are symbolized perfectly in Michael Fassbender's David, who arguably has the most interesting arc in both this film and the sequel film Alien Covenant, and quickly became the MVP of those 2 movies, as despite Alien Covenant's great decrease in quality, it still has a lot of similar themes and awesome moments, boasting an amazing cast, some spectacular visuals, and a surprisingly not sucky third act. Prometheus comes down as the surprise entry here, because rather than being predictably good Scott like The Martian, it functions more like the underdog, which more than earns it a spot on this list. Legend. Ridley Scott directing an 80s dark fantasy film starring Tom Cruise in his last role prior to Top Gun? Sign me up. This subgenre, which consists of films like Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, The Neverending Story, and Willow, has slowly evolved to become one of my favorites in the last couple of years. So hearing that Ridley Scott helped contribute to that made me intrigued, to say the least. The ironic thing here is that the genre may have been falsely named, because despite them being dark in tone, they still follow along with the typical Campbell's hero's journey tropes, not to mention that the films usually aren't that dark in subject matter, but more so due to visual aesthetic. Crazy disturbing creature designs, very low lighting, stuff of that ilk. All of this is on full display for this film, which follows Tom Cruise as he sets out to stop the forces of the Prince of Darkness, played in a deliciously over-the-top and prosthetics covered Tim Curry, who's attempting to extinguish all the light in the world by killing the last unicorn. It's a film that's almost been lost to history, but it still stands out as unique, if a bit traditionalist, which is why for me, it makes a spot on this list. Black Hawk Down. We've all seen our fair share of great war movies, but when you get Ridley on it, next level. You can see a lot of influence from his brother Tony's movies, as those pretty much set the precedent for action movies for the next 40 years. Not to mention that the quick-cut, close-up documentary-like style was later on pretty much retconned by Catherine Bigelow. However, only a few months after 9/11, Scott directed a film that captured all the terror, unpredictability, and craziness of America's latest overseas conflict and brought it to the big screen. While this isn't a film that I think has aged amazingly well in terms of subject matter, on a technical scale, it is still unlike any other film, truly trailblazing across the screen a new manner of presentation for the war film. Quick cut, on the ground, very visceral style of camera work by cinematographer Sławomir Idziak brings a tone that grips from the moment the action starts all the way to the very end. Scott often doesn't get the credit that he deserves in his contribution to the shift in major motion picture making each decade, but this is one of the films that definitely makes the case for that. American Gangster. Oh man, Why is this one still not talked about as one of Denzel's best or one of the best that the crime genre has to offer? Scott's ability to handle pretty much any tone may make his style less distinct, but it also allows him to surprise people when he pulls out such a solid crime installment that frankly does not get the respect that it deserves. Chronicling Denzel Washington's journey as Frank Lucas, Harlem's next kingpin following the death of Bumpy Johnson, with tactics including importing heroin directly from Vietnam in the coffins of fallen soldiers, and the quest to bring him down led by Richie Roberts, portrayed by frequent Scott collaborator Russell Crowe. While the film certainly is fat at times, the charisma and pure force brought to the screen by Denzel, combined with the surprisingly subdued filmmaking, is more than enough to earn this film a spot in the crime canon. And it still baffles me why this doesn't get more love than it does, especially having been released in 2007, one of the greatest movie years ever. Matchstick Men. Two people, Ridley Scott and Nicolas Cage. A match that should not work as well as it does, and then it works even better. Based on Eric Garcia's 2002 novel, Scott directs the film from screenwriters Ted and Nicholas Griffin, in which Cage is Roy Waller as a con man alongside his partner Frank, portrayed by Sam Rockwell. The two of them run a scheme where they rip people off with fake prizes, but Cage's constant neuroses and severe OCD provides a constant hindrance that slowly causes him to start to unfold mentally. Reconnecting with a long-lost daughter, he soon begins teaching her con man skills to disastrous results. The thing that's so awesome about this movie is that without spoiling anything, it plays out like a long con itself, drawing you in and then pulling the rug out from under you at the last second with a twist to end all twists. It's an awesome heist, crime, screwball comedy, father-daughter bonding, amazingly well-written movie, and Scott's subtle but stylistic direction along with the fantastic script really causes this one to stand out from others of its ilk. Kingdom of Heaven. A couple of things have come to define Ridley Scott as a director in his very long tenure in Hollywood. His best films usually tend to be in the historically inaccurate epic or science fiction. His films are always long, and he loves his alternate cuts. But before the Snyder Cut movement began, there was Kingdom of Heaven. After a break from big-budget epics with Matchstick Men, Scott returned to that realm with a story featuring another major period in ancient history, this time the Crusades, following Orlando Bloom as a blacksmith who's recruited by a man who's revealed to be his father to come and defend Jerusalem against a pending attack. In what would result in the Battle of Hattin, the film combined Scott's signature sense of scale and epic-level storytelling. Despite the film getting pretty positive reviews upon its release, Scott released a 3-hour-long director's cut that December, which pretty much everyone has come to know was the definitive version of the film, and it shows. Entire subplots that help to flesh the film out even more are included here, all of which truly does help the film to become the modern-day version of, say, like a David Lean or an Akira Kurosawa movie. It continues in Scott's unintentional changing of filmmaking, as the emphasis here is on grand sweeping landscapes, immaculate set design, and impressive cinematography, all set to bring arguably one of the more awesome stories to life. It's been hailed as one of the best epic films ever made, and by some, even one of the best films ever made, which more than earns it a spot on this list. Thelma and Louise. The movie that would usher in the next phase of incredible female-led films. For Fincher and Gillian Flynn, there was Ridley Scott and Callie Corey. The story of two women essentially carrying out their own version of Bonnie and Clyde, with the motivation coming, however, from a source of self-preservation this time, rather than self-interest. After Susan Sarandon's Louise saves Gina Davis's Thelma from almost being sexually assaulted at the beginning of their trip. The film is the ultimate feminist movie, just about two friends spending some of their last days of their lives together, having the time of their lives. Some of the activities include getting robbed by a breakout Brad Pitt, taking a policeman captive, blowing up a foul-mouthed oil driller's truck, and going out in a blaze of glory by driving off the edge of the frickin' Grand Canyon in a scene that has been parodied to death, but still hits home every time. Ridley Scott is a director whose style really only shows itself off in particular films of his, and this movie falls into the category of films that surprise you when you find out that he directed it. It's a movie about pursuing the American dream, providing a surprising take on Bonnie and Clyde-esque adventures in which our two heroines are thrown up against the world at a time when women were finally finding their voices. It inspired feminists and movie lovers for generations to come, and it still lends itself as one of the best road movies ever. Gladiator. One of a couple movies released in the late 90s, early 2000s with one of the biggest nightmare productions that ended up being not only a blockbuster summer smash, but also a multi-Academy Award winning film and cultural landmark. Talk about epic. This film was an absolute disaster behind the scenes, with actors constantly complaining about the script, it being rewritten 3 different times by 3 different writers, lead actor Russell Crowe almost walking off the set because he questioned every single aspect of the film, as he does, not to mention the extensive shoot across 3 countries. Then, of course, there was the issue of the visuals, with Proximo actor Oliver Reed dying before completion of the film, forcing VFX company The Mill to spend an extra $3.2 million for a deepfake, something that now could be done by YouTubers for a laugh. All of this, and it still resulted in one of the most epic films of all time. It's all in the movie's tagline. The story of a general who became a slave who became a gladiator who defied an emperor. Crowe's performance as Maximus certainly commands an air of respect from the moment he walks on screen, and he perfectly nails the tightrope balancing act he walks between ferocious, merciful, and inspiring loyalty from everyone around him. More of a personal note from me, but it also still surprises me how awesome Joaquin Phoenix is in this movie as Commodus, mostly because he never does these kinds of movies now, Joker aside. But it was certainly interesting to see him pull off this complex of a villain character in a gigantically budgeted epic and be so good that he can go toe-to-toe with Crowe in their scenes together, rightfully earning his first Oscar nomination for supporting actor. It also kind of pulls an Avatar in that it's a very basic story, but its grand scope and epic feeling pushes it from basic to great. The film won Best Picture and Best Actor for Crowe at that year's Academy Awards, although not Best Director for Scott, and it's telling, given that the transition from the 90s to the 2000s, from the old millennium to the new, saw tight-knit drama around fastidiously interesting characters give way for more basic, more easily appealing stories told on the grandest scale possible, with the money and emphasis put more so on visual effects and scope rather than story. It's the film that basically classified Scott as the new epics director, and it set the stage for pretty much every big-budget film that followed. Alien, the movie that made Scott a household name and jump-started the science fiction horror subgenre. Scott's career path has been very interesting, because even though he's arguably one of the biggest and most influential filmmakers of the last 40 years, he's always been much more of a working man's director rather than a true auteurist. Like, very rarely do you recognize something as a Ridley Scott film the way you would say like a Spielberg or a Tarantino or even an M. Night Shyamalan. And what's even crazier is that despite the fact that Scott has gotten the most amount of attention and praise for this movie after Sigourney Weaver, he was the last person to join the project. It's interesting that this film came out 1 year after the original Halloween, because it was these two movies that pretty much set the slasher formula for the next 40 years. The story of 7 astronauts thousands of years in the future who stumble upon a distress signal coming from a deserted planet that leads to a killer alien being unleashed on the ship. Slowly, the creature takes out the crew, one by one, along with secrets being revealed before the final girl, Ellen Ripley, defeats the creature. I could write an entire essay on the history and lore of the Alien franchise, but the subject here is Scott. And what this film does is put him on the map. He came in at the very end of the 70s, the last of the film brats to really stand out, along with George Miller, but he emerges as one of the prominent directors of the 21st century, with decade-defining films released in each of the next 4 decades, and it all started with this movie. Before we move on to the number 1 choice, here are some honorable mentions. Blade Runner. This movie has such a fascinating history because it underperformed at the box office upon its initial release back in 1982, but went on to gain a hardcore following, a sequel 35 years later, and the mantle of one of the 10 greatest science fiction films ever made. Based off the short story Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, this film takes place in Los Angeles 2019. Wow, did not realize we're technically past this movie now. And follows detective or Blade Runner Rick Deckard, portrayed by Harrison Ford, who's commissioned to track down and retire 4 rogue replicants, bioengineered humanoid androids that can basically pass themselves off as human. It's the movie that kicked off Scott's career-long obsession with androids and artificial intelligence, so much so that when he returned to the Alien franchise in 2012, he essentially refocused the entire thing on the android characters. Look, it's no secret that this film is a pinnacle of science fiction filmmaking, but if I can add one new thing to the conversation around this film, it's how it revolutionized science fiction filmmaking, and that literally every single movie that featured either a sci-fi look or a dystopic look borrowed that from this movie exactly, and I mean to a T. Alien was only 3 years before this, but this was the first true demonstration of Scott's skills as a visual storyteller on a grand level, but also how he was able to capture those itty-bitty, juicy little humane moments, which is ironic considering those abilities have definitely fallen to the wayside in more recent years. The cold, rigid, black and white view that Deckard lives his life by is broken apart with the introduction of this latest batch of replicants into his life, as not only does he have to hunt down and brutally murder these robots who seem to be more human than he is, but also finds himself romantically involved with one, a full 30 years before her was even a conception. The discussion around humanity within artificial beings has become so pressing that it's even become a real-world topic of discussion, but this was the film that originated it in the mainstream. It's the definition of a cult hit, the science fiction film that would influence every single one after it, and hands down the best film that Ridley Scott has ever directed. And that was it. Those were my top 10 favorite Ridley Scott movies. What are some of your guys' favorite Ridley Scott movies? Whatever they are, leave them in the comments section below, and be sure to also click the like button and the subscribe button. That way you guys can get notified every time we put up new content on YouTube. Also, be sure to follow us on the social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast. And as always, people, remember, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.